Hey, Linda, how you doing?
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, enjoying this I don't know, kind of springy weather I suppose we're having.
I was just thinking it was so funny that I think we met exactly 5 years ago today.
Wow.
Um, I know it popped up in a kind of a photo memory thing, and it was at Bell Percussion, and we were trying out ideas for this piece, Ekstasis.
That's that's amazing. Facebook
Yeah.
feed. Facebook feed for happy times and happy
I
memories.
know. When we were actually out in the world making work. So,
Yes. It was hedonistic.
a different time.
It was, and actually rather sadly Bell Percussion is no longer more. No, is no more. It's shut down this year as a result of the pandemic. There's just no way for so many of our music businesses to carry on. So
Really
yeah,
sad.
did we? I wonder. I seem to remember meeting in Dublin a few times as well. Maybe
I
that's my
think that was
imagination.
after that, actually, a
Okay.
few times. And I was aware of you through your work in multimedia with Power Plant, and then you had worked, of course, with Donna Dennehy, who I know very well. So I suppose I was very interested in the way that you kind of blurred boundaries between genres, and you were kind of very interested in lots of different styles of music. And I felt a kinship with that, I think, very early on. So I think it's great the way we ended up working together because I think we would have very similar interests in music as well.
Yeah, no, totally. I remember some of those first conversations we had, and we just ended up talking about, as you do, talking about the sort of records you love and the records you grew up with, and with things like Kate Bush and The Cure and
Yeah.
all that sort of
Aphex
stuff.
Twin, I think, came up a bit.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds
all of
right.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, amazing. It's always really special when you find someone you think you probably will share, the same musical language and joys and experiences with, and then you get all these records you haven't. Just fantastic, fantastic.
I
And
think
I hit.
beyond that as well, like because I felt, I mean, even the way that you are interested in presenting music in a different way with a lot of like multimedia elements, and it's quite kind of informal a lot of the time, and you talk to the audience, and it's like you kind of break down that wall. And I suppose I was always very interested in doing that as well in my own life. So I think seeing that in the work of others has always been interesting for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's essential. I think being a percussionist, we always have this kind of problem where we have these instruments between us and whoever our audience is. So yeah, it's finding ways to find people who are interested in the work that composers like yourself are doing. There's amazing music, and I think sometimes we sort of label it in this kind of crazy classical or you know new classical or contemporary music way, and it's not. I mean, it's it's something that's just come from the heart and some interesting place. So that first experience was really remembering back to Bell Percussion, working on this amazing piece Ekstasis, which you wrote, and tell us, remind us why, where did that come from? I know I phoned you up and said, would you be part of this Pioneers project? What do you want to do? Where do you go from a question like that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was kind of interested in looking at percussion in a different way, so showing a very kind of rich immersive side of it as opposed to something maybe more raucous and rhythmic and percussive in that sense. And I was thinking about loves of mine, like medieval music, like medieval harmony is all over that piece. Sometimes echoing back to people like Masho or Leonan or Peritan. And there's elements of ambient electronica in there, of course, from a big interest in my own life and what I do. And then there's a lot of kind of Javanese gamelan elements too. So it's kind of like bringing all those worlds together. And they would have kind of equally been a big influence on me over my life. There's even like samples of gamelan in there. So it was lovely to feel that the whole thing was very kind of unified, and that the listeners just entering this kind of trance-like space or something. And I suppose when I was writing it, I always loved the quote from Morton Feldman. He talks about, experiencing music as if you're not listening, but looking at something in nature. So it's that kind of
Wow.
idea that's just sort of entering a space and you're sort of being in that space and almost like playing with the passing of time. So I suppose in that piece, it kind of does play with your sense of time. I mean, even when I listen to it now, it's very hard to know whether a minute has passed or 10 minutes has passed. You know, it's kind of like that one where you're just in it and you're kind of in the world of it. And then I suppose the title then Ekstasis is kind of to do with ecstatic states and kind of trance-like states. And you know, Bob Gilmore, you know, the musicologist, wrote about that in my own music before I ever had written this piece, you know. So it kind of, in a way, it was like a full circle thing where bringing the ecstasis element out in real foregrounded form in a way, even though it had been in my music in you know, more instinctive, unconscious ways over the years. But this was about actually kind of like a study in that in a way.
And ecstasis is the Greek for ecstasy, is that right? Yeah, so it's a very
And
literal.
exactly, it is very literal, and it kind of means, you know, kind of being outside of yourself, you know, which I think is interesting. I suppose at the moment with lockdown, I think a lot of us are kind of in our own heads a lot of the time. So it's kind of about coming out of your own head and just almost floating in time or something.
Yeah, it's a very evocative piece. I always, imagine I haven't been to Iceland. I was meant to go last year, and I always imagine that some of those sort of vistas, and I also think a lot about Rothko's amazing, large paintings whenever I'm playing your piece, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about Feldman. Obviously, Feldman is on this first volume of this project, and Feldman is not someone that I've played loads of music. Did you know that solo piece that's on the same program?
I didn't actually, no, I
Right.
didn't know that particular piece. I had been always very interested in him for his bigger pieces like Coptic Light for orchestra, and you know, that kind of
Mm.
idea of like blurred edges and that kind of Rothko idea as well. But I didn't really know of his smaller works in that way. So it's
Yeah,
fascinating to see that.
it's that. I mean, it's a really unusual piece because it's 6 7 minutes long, and you need too many instruments for 6 7 minutes, to be honest. Or it feels like it sometimes. How did you arrive at the choice of instruments? I can't quite remember how that came to pass. If
I
that was me
suppose
or
it's
you.
the whole thing about writing for percussion, isn't it? Like, as in, you know, as a composer, when you're working at the beginning of a piece, you have to make certain decisions about, you know, do I focus in on a certain number of pitches or a certain kind of pattern or certain instrumentation, or if there's so many possibilities open to you, it can be really hard to enter the world of it in a focused way, you know. And I imagined this kind of very focused sound world, which was, you know, probably a little bit kind of strange and mysterious and ethereal. So that's, I suppose, the idea of the bowed vibraphone. I mean, I've always loved the sound of the bowed vibraphone anyway. Um, and then using gongs as well. So I suppose a lot of the electronic aspect uses samples of that and recordings of that and processed in different ways. So about making the connection between the live and electronic in a really close sense where you don't really know which is which I always love in experiencing any music that combines those elements. So I suppose it was almost like this kind of sound world that I could hear in my head that I wanted to create. And you created it so beautifully.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, yeah, I need the notes.
You
And what were there any unusual challenges about writing for percussion? Had you? I mean, the things that I knew when I got to know your work were the beautiful piece that Dara plays,
Exploding stars.
Exploding Stars,
Yeah.
which is obviously solo violin with electronics, and there's a shorter, I think it was a slightly more recent piece for cello and electronics. It was Jump. Is that right? Which
Yeah,
is
that's for
sort of
Kate Ellis.
yeah, slightly different sort of vibe. But I knew those two pieces when I started um, getting in contact with you to think about this project. So it seems like quite a natural journey. But had you used percussion a lot before? Was that a new challenge or?
But not really. It was in a way for me because it was kind of like thinking about how to really still be myself in this other kind of sound world. And the thing with percussion, I suppose, that I notice maybe a lot with people is that there's this feeling of like, well, there's so many possibilities, and I could, you know, use everything, and that sense of like actually the music that I'm drawn to most probably doesn't really do that. I mean, even though sometimes I'm quite fond of that kind of John Zorn thing of like, you know, going from crazy contrasts all the time. But the music that I'm probably more drawn to is something that stays in this world for a long period of time. So I really wanted to kind of hone it down into very few instruments, because it could have been a very different piece, of course, and even even the other piece that we worked on, Discordia, has this quite kind of unified sound world as well. But I think in other work going forward with percussion, I would be quite interested in almost doing the opposite of that, of kind of like using like multiple instruments and sort of really
Yeah.
maximum contrast and things like that. So, and really kind of rock as something really intense and
Yeah.
rhythmic and fast, and so I feel like I've explored that side of it, and now it could be interesting to go the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. Open the toy shop.
Exactly.
Full
That's it.
maximum toy cupboard. I share that sentiment, and also with a number of other composers, about writing for percussion, is that there has been this historically thing of just filling a stage full of as many things as you can find, and often with a number of the concertos that have come out, it's basically an orchestra, then a mountain of percussion, and often a soloist running up and down the front of the stage trying to hit as many things as possible. Whereas for me, and what I've really enjoyed, are those pieces where you focus on one instrument. So a lot of the pieces that I've ended up playing and also commissioning have ended up having that sort of tightness of sound, which I think means you probably get a lot deeper into what is possible with the instruments. I mean, I think certainly with Ekstasis, there's an extensive amount of bowing. There's a bit of vibrato from the sort of wah-wah effect. There's some interesting four mallet writing, and then there's those beautiful gongs which blend with the vibes, but also blend with your gamelan samples and those voices. There's voices in the electronics as well, isn't there?
That's me. Yeah, yeah.
Ah, you're
So I'm in a lot of my own pieces in that sense. In sometimes kind of more buried and sometimes coming to the forefront a bit more. But I mean, I think like actually, in my recent album, like a lot of the electronics have my vocals in them. Actually, I even looked at them as something like maybe 6 of 9 pieces or something have that. So it's something that comes through a lot in my own work, I think, and it's something that I suppose is just very instinctive, and I only kind of realize after the fact when I look back at a body of work and I'm like, actually, my voice is in so many of these pieces.
yeah.
Because I can hear something and I naturally want to add to the textures that I'm creating, and often it is vocal.
So you grew up in Southern Islands, right at the bottom. That the
Tiny
old,
little peninsula.
yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously knowing more and more of your work now, I hear a lot of what I would just assume to be childhood things you've learned through childhood and singing, and you play flute as well, don't you? Um, and it seems like there's a sense of place from those experiences there, and then you're obviously in Dublin for some years. How does that sense of place, I suppose, particularly with your Irish heritage, how does that manifest itself?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, but it's also something that is so much a deep part of me that it's not something that I think about all the time. I think
Hmm.
it's just emerges very instinctively in the work. And this can vary depending on where I am as well. So at the time, I suppose, growing up in a place like the Old Head of Kinsale, jutting out right into the Atlantic Ocean, I didn't think it was an unusual place to live, because that's just what you know what you know. And it was only years later when I, kind of left probably secondary school, when I met people who'd grown up in cities and in tower blocks and things, and thinking their experience had been so different to my own, in terms of just kind of looking out at this expanse of land and ocean and things. And I I suppose I really understand it now and I appreciate it more now, and I think I'm drawn to that in other places that I travel to. So like I've written a lot of music in Iceland and in Gotland and the Baltic Sea. So I think there's something about these very open landscapes, often cold Nordic islands that I have gone to, that have
Yeah.
really impacted on my work. And I remember writing music in Iceland, and just feeling like the whole sound had kind of expanded out within the first few days of working there, and being kind of amazed by it just very naturally. But then I'm also drawn to kind of energies of places. So like New York, like, and Berlin. I spent a lot of time in Berlin around kind of 15 years ago, when there was this very underground electronic improv scene. And there would be gigs on in kind of like underground bunkers and places, and very kind of exciting and strange, oftentimes experimental. And then New York, the energy of just so many different things happening at once, just that feeling of maybe going to 3 or 4 gigs in a night, and could be jazz, could be medieval music, could be electronic, could be songwriter, could be and just being inspired by that as well. So it's sometimes it can be the energy of a place and the soul of a place, and not just landscape in terms of what it looks like.
Yeah. How you talked a bit about New York, and obviously I remember you going to New York probably not long after you did Ekstasis, and you got a Fulbright scholarship, I think, and you were there for a year or maybe a bit longer.
The year,
Yeah, and that was kind of an interesting time politically.
it was. I mean, who knew that all of that would have gone down like very soon after I moved there for that year, and it was a very strange time. I mean, because I think it was maybe September that I went there first, and then all that happened a few months after that. With
This is
the change of
September.
president.
This is September 2016.
Exactly. Yeah,
So you were there for a couple of months, and then obviously Mr. Trump became elected president of the United States.
It was a very strange time in terms of New York being the place that it is, which would be the very opposite of his values most of the time. So it was, the atmosphere around that was very strange, and discordia emerged, of course, out of that time.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing that you then, having written one piece for me, wrote me another piece a year or so later, which was inspired by your time in New York, which that piece is incredibly dark and verging on apocalyptic at times. What did you during your I mean, I've always lived in England. I've never apart from years of touring to various bits of the world, I've never actually made any routes for any number of months anywhere else in the world apart from 3 or 4 places in England, which I've greatly enjoyed. And as you say, they're all the places that I call home. And what did you do? What were the highlights, or the things you took away from that time in New York?
So many highlights. I mean, it was kind of the spontaneity and the randomness of life in a way, which I suppose is so different to what we're experiencing at the moment. So, when I have very specific memories of a particular night, I'm kind of blown away by how exciting it was, in terms of maybe playing in, a loft in Brooklyn in this very experimental electronic improv gig, and then maybe going to another show which is like dark ambient electronic or something, and all these things just sort of seeming really possible, and just the vibrancy of it all, and how every day was so different. That's the thing that struck me, I suppose. For a while I was actually in a kind of vocal improv group which met every week in Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
We would come together and sing, which was amazing. And at the time it seemed like this kind of normal thing that we did every week, and now looking back, it's kind of amazing to me, just all the experiences I had and how they kind of seeped into what I went on to do after, I think, as well.
So it was kind of a year of research and new opportunities and new tastes and sounds and all that sort of stuff.
Because it could have been very kind of academic and just sitting composing, but it wasn't really. It was much more outward. It was much more about playing, and it was much more about meeting people and embracing the kind of randomness of the everyday, and working with folk musicians, working with all these different people. So I'm really glad I did that, actually, because in a situation like that, I did have music to write, and I did write music when I was there, but it was more about embracing actually being there, where doing things that I couldn't do anywhere else, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah. And now you're back in the UK. You're in Glasgow. You've been there for a couple of years now, I think.
3 years now. Yeah.
3 years. Okay, so two. Well, I suppose the last year sort of got away from everyone, hasn't it?
Can we count that at all? Yeah.
I think it goes on the clock, but memorable in possibly not quite enough ways.
Yeah.
Um, um, and you obviously you've got a position there at the RCS, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, where you lecture composition or electronic music, or
It's composition.
okay,
Yeah.
so straight up composition. How does having a position like that? I know you had that previously in Dublin. How do you balance your timesheets and energy between your teaching and your your composing and your I suppose on one side you're there helping people um, get their own voice out, and on the other hand you're busy writing
Yeah.
and making
Yeah.
things. How does that work?
Well, I think, I suppose for me, when I was younger and I was a student of Donnacha Dennehy's
Oh
in
right,
Trinity
wow.
College, he was my teacher for my PhD and for some of my masters as well. So I would have known him very well, and then afterwards, kind of through the crash ensemble and things. And
Mm,
I suppose I would see him out there really active as a composer all the time while I was a student, and I thought that that was really good for me to see actually as kind of a, I suppose, a role model. And I suppose I think it is probably good for the students to see that I am very active and that I'm out there in the world and I'm doing things all the time, taking on different projects. But yes, there is the very practical thing of like, how do you make it work in terms of the time and the
yeah,
headspace and all of that? Because it's not just time, because it's also headspace. Um, and I think I have to sometimes be just very strict about the days that I'm not teaching, that I don't allow any other element to creep into the creative process of the work that I'm making and really get my head into it. So I would kind of say half the week is, doing my own projects, and half the week would be with teaching. And I'm just very clear about the divisions between those things, where I don't allow any kind of bleeding in of one into the other, because it can be too much of a mental shift for me.
yeah,
So, I also usually get a lot written in the summer and in Easter time and Christmas time and things like that. So making the most out of those pockets of time that you have, where you have maybe a run of a month where you can really get into something. So I
yeah,
really make maximum use of all of that as well.
yeah. And because you must, I assume, but I don't think we've talked about it before, but you must write in your studio or at a computer for some considerable amount of time for most of your pieces. Because
Yeah.
am I right in thinking that there's an electronic component to everything you've written?
No, I mean, I have like a lot of pieces that are just purely orchestral or just instrumental or ensemble, or I think probably in the last few years, most of the work has been with electronics, all
Yeah,
right, and that's a big feature of my record. So I suppose, as a body of work that's now out in the world in that sense, the strand of mixing acoustic and electronic is very strong in that. So it is a big element of what I do, but not all the time. Like at the moment, for example, I'm working on a piece that's for ensemble and electronics, and I'm also working on a different piece which is for just mezzo soprano and piano, so that's purely acoustic.
oh
um
wow,
hmm.
this is all new to me. I'm going to have to go and check out Linda Buckley
A whole
acoustic,
other body of work that's purely acoustic.
the acoustic selection.
I know, exactly.
Oh wow,
Unplugged, Buckley unplugged.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a program in there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And so, yeah, you were just talking about your record. So last year you made this. It's a stunning record. I mean, I really love it. This is a record called From Ocean's Floor, which was released on NMC. I suppose was it September or October last
September,
year?
end of
Yeah,
September. Yeah.
and it embodies this, you know, beautiful selection of pieces. One of which I very generously you asked me to record Discordia for on this disc, which is the second of the two pieces that you wrote for me. And there's obviously the beautiful piece that Dara plays, which was I think it's the earliest piece on the record. Tell us about some of the other works. I mean, I particularly wasn't. I don't think I was expecting when I put the disc on when it arrived, and I stuck it in the car CD player because it's the easiest way to find a CD player still in my house. Um, this music started, and it's stunning. Tell us a bit about the works and the journey of this album.
Well, it's always an interesting thing when you're asked to put out a record like that and trying to decide on what pieces to actually put on there. And I wanted it to feel like a cohesive sort of journey for a listener. and that there was a thread that ran through everything. So of course, in a technical sense, the thread is acoustic and electronic. That is in all of the music. But I also wanted it to be a different kind of journey in terms of like the atmosphere and the places that I've been, and that you would stick it on and listen to the whole as an album. And I suppose that's always been important to me in other music. Like, as you know, we were talking earlier about bands that we like The Cure and things like that. And you know, the album Disintegration, like I love listening to that whole album, you know, and
Mm.
you would listen to it from beginning to end, and it's not just about choosing certain tracks within it, but the whole thing. And I wanted that, you know, that it wouldn't be just kind of a kind of a random selection of things that I do, but that it would feel cohesive, you know. And I think I hopefully achieved that. But the first thing that I wanted to put on there was this song cycle that I had written for Irla, Olenord, and Crash Ensemble, because um, I really felt that um, the atmosphere of that kind of would be a really good start to the record. And then it kind of moves into darker territories, like especially in Discordia. Um, and through things like Kyrie, which is kind of quite dark ambient, and back out into the stars with exploding stars at the end. So it's kind of, I mean, like in a way, some of that was a little bit intuitive, but then it was quite interesting to read about it. A lovely review in The Guardian by Jude Rogers, and she talks about beginning in the sea and ending in the stars. And I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
there you go. So, I mean, in a way, that was kind of a little bit of a happy accident, but because those are like the first poems that are used for the song cycle are about the sea and things like that, and then of course it ends up in outer space. So,
Yeah, I
so
hadn't.
that's a nice kind of
I,
connection.
I haven't seen that review, so I hadn't made that connection either. Wow, but that's beautiful, yeah. But that first piece, I mean, it's strings. It's that beautiful. There's a special technique that he uses in the singing.
Well, he sings Shanos, which is the old style unaccompanied Irish singing, which is often very melismatic, very ornamental, and from West Cork. So he would be from the same county as me, but further west. So he would have grown up singing like that. And I remember hearing the sound of his voice from when I was very young. He's kind of a really sort of iconic figure in Ireland, and has been amazing to work with, you know.
Wow, and is that the one piece you've worked on together, or is there more of?
We have done smaller things as well besides that before that, as little kind of precursors to that. But I think
Yeah,
we probably will do more. I imagine we will. But I mean,
yeah,
also to say like it was amazing in a way to put this out in the middle of strange times and lockdown and pandemic.
mm,
And I remember thinking, I don't know what's going to happen with this, because there's no way we can perform anything. We can't have launches. We can't have concerts. We can't be out there doing interviews or whatever. And so I was so heartened to see the response, and that it did reach a lot of people, and it has gone
yeah,
out into the world, and has reached people who are from lots of different pools in, you know, electronic music, folk, classical, like all across the spectrum, which is kind of what I would have loved to see happen, and it did sort of happen. So I'm so delighted about that. And you know, Iggy Pop, you know, playing
oh yeah,
Discordia. So
yeah. You
you know,
got a
there's
lot
all
of.
of that, which was really unexpected and lovely. So
Yeah. So Iggy Pop has got this Radio 6 music program, which wasn't a program that I don't think I knew, or I'd only heard it in passing. And it's great to hear him do anything, because his voice and the gravel is just beautiful. And he played Discordia, which we should talk about a little bit for people who don't know what that crazy instrument is that I play and you worked with. But did he played something else, didn't he, as well?
so that was the second time he played something from the record. He played, that was like, yeah, it was New Year's Day of this year, and
Right.
but it was like mid December. He also played one of the Irla songs.
Oh, cool.
Um, so it was great that he kind of showed different sides of the record in a way.
It's great. It's really nice when things potentially pop up where maybe you weren't expecting them, or
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was such a lovely moment of, especially the first time, you know, I'm just in my kitchen and I'm listening to like a physical radio that I have there, and I just heard him saying my name, and I was like, like, I just looked at the radio and stared at it and thought, what is
is this
happening?
me?
Yeah, it's so strange. It was brilliant.
Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's
Mm.
fantastic. It's fantastic. I'm so pleased the album's doing so well, and it's got such great reviews. And I'll stick a link in the description to this video, so people want to go listen to it. They can find it on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever. But yeah, we've mentioned this piece Discordia a couple of times. This piece it's got some memories of your time in New York, but it was a commission for Power Plant, my project with Kathy Hines, a video artist, and Matthew Fairclough, sound designer, as part of a concert that was given at Milton Court in the Barbican in 2018, and they very kindly said to me, "Would you like to commission someone for this concert as a special thing?" I said, "Yeah, I will get Linda to write a piece of the big harp." And I remember the when we got together for the premiere performance of Ekstasis back in some point in early 2016, I guess, or sometime around then. I was playing this. I did this arrangement of opus for archers using what I am calling my big harp, but it's actually an instrument called an aluminium harp, or a canna sonora, or rub rods, if you're being Jerry Goldsmith in Hollywood, which are these giant rods of aluminium which you play using friction. And I remember you saying when you walked into the room, saying, "Yeah, I like that. Oh, I want to do something with that." So it seems like, even though we were just, we've been on a little bit of a journey. You'd written Ekstasis, and I was premiering it, and obviously there's been lots of performances since then. There was always going to be this kind of other piece, and there was a really obvious what this other piece, or what the instrument for this other piece was going to be. And there's something really nice about the vibraphone, which is obviously made of aluminium, and the aluminium harp, which is the same material. In fact, they were first produced by the same guy in the same company in Chicago, Deegan, in sort of late 1920s. Vibraphone is a bit more successful than the aluminium harp, but the aluminium harp's quite a good sound. Yeah. So tell us a bit about how, I don't know, how you went about writing that piece. There's a bit more back and forth, I seem to remember, with that piece. We tried a few things out, and
well, I remember, like, it's funny that you mentioned there the chat we had when I first heard that instrument, because it's so lovely to see that something that you might have mentioned in passing, which was that chat that we had, ended up being this fully fledged commission and piece and out in the world. So it's a kind of a good rule of thumb, like, never be quiet about the things that you'd like to do, like actually say them, verbalize them. So that was really, I'm glad I did that, and that you remembered it. But I remember being so in awe of that instrument. And one of the things I suppose I noticed when I went and visited you in the studio was, of course, the amount of resonance it has and the kind of very long decay time of it. And I've always been drawn to these kind of electronic sounds like theremins, and in a way it kind of has that sort of sound world to it. But I wondered about, what if you play the instrument in a way where you don't actually stop the sound, that you actually let it ring out, you let it resonate. And I remember kind of years ago with gamelan, Javanese gamelan, trying out playing passages really quickly and just letting the whole thing ring out without damping the keys on certain instruments. And I remember being really in love with that sound and kind of wanting to try something like that, and then augment that kind of blurriness and immersiveness through electronics. So it's like most of the electronics are built from processed aluminium harp, and then of course later it gets thicker and there's voices and all that in there too. But yeah, it was that kind of idea of maybe taking something as well that is quite, it is actually quite melodic as well, but then recontextualizing that. So maybe at the beginning the melody has an accompaniment almost, which feels quite kind of solid and steady, and then later that really, the ground is kind of pulled from under you, and it pushes and pulls against it. And I wanted that kind of feeling of something remaining steady and something, something in flux underneath it, I guess.
yeah, it's a really stunning piece of work, and I spent several years trying to work out what would be or who perhaps might be the right person to bring that instrument to the forefront. And the piece you wrote is just stunning.
But I have to say, like, a lot of that is to do with the collaborative nature of how you work as well. You know, I really don't think that piece could have existed without that kind of back and forth and trying things out. And, you know, especially with an instrument like that, there's no way that I could have gone away and just tried to work out something myself without really feeling the physicality of it and trying out ideas with you. So it's kind of such a gift for a composer to get to work with someone in that way, you know.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's for me, that's kind of the most interesting, well, one of the most interesting bits of my job is that sort of exploring some nugget and um, seeing how it sounds. Because often people ask, unusual things, and surely you can do this, and then something that you might have, I might have played, several times and thought nothing of. Someone would just pick up on that small technique or whatever and be totally inspired by it. I seem to
Mm.
remember us talking about clouds quite a lot when
Mm.
that started.
Clouds of sound.
These tiny little cells of um, just pairs of notes that created these
Mm-hmm.
tiny phrases, and that's where the piece starts, and then it grows and it grows and it grows and gets darker and more twisted as it goes on.
And I was also thinking, I suppose, about the visual element of it because I loved watching you play it, like and you know those moments of where we have vibrato and all of that. Like, I mean, I think visually it looks really so kind of arresting and kind of striking. And I was thinking about that, I suppose, as I was writing it as well. You know, like the physical gesture and what kind of sound does that make, and um, all of that.
Yeah, it's quite big and quite tedious to cart around the country, but that's fine. Sometimes you have to get these.
Perfect.
Sometimes you just have to get these silly instruments, and because you're right, people, if you're doing percussion or you're working with a percussionist or on a percussion project, then there is a whole physical vibe to it. There's a whole thing, you see the sound being produced, and this is an instrument that barely anyone will ever have seen played anywhere. You might have heard it in passing in Poltergeist in the early 80s or something like that, but by and large it's not a known. Although I just discovered the other day, some friends of mine who run a hire firm in Los Angeles would was showing some examples of the aluminium harp, or as it's called in the States, the rub rods, which appear in Back to the Future.
No way.
Yeah. So when Doc unveils when Doc unveils the DeLorean for the first time to Michael J. Fox, Marty. Yeah, it's Marty McFly, isn't it? There's rub rods on the thing, and I think there's waterphone and stuff in it as well. So it's kind of, and then that's part of the sound of that score, which is great.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So maybe I could do a Back to the Future mode. I don't know. Probably not.
Now, are you the only person in the country that has one?
Well, I actually saw one at Air Studios years and years ago, and I think it probably belonged to a percussionist called Steve Henderson, and I think it might have been one of the original Deegan ones. Probably knowing him, it is, and it was. It still is, I suppose. Much smaller instruments, so I'm not sure about the pitches, but yeah, sound similar. So yeah, it's always nice to have something that other people don't.
Unique. Very
Yeah,
unique.
it's
Yeah.
quite, I mean, it's great because you can sort of start building a repertoire, and you've got some sounds that are different. But yeah, when I first came across it, I think in 2013 or 14, and then I had it shipped over from the States to the UK. One of the first things I used it for was this Takemitsu piece that I play. He talked about glass rods, but rods are rods, so very similar, very similar sort of a sound.
That very pure sine tone like sound, you know, that's
Yeah,
similar as well.
yeah, and I think again, lends itself so well to sitting in with the electronics.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Perfect one for that.
yeah, no, worked really well. Yeah, so you talked we talked a lot about New York. We talked a bit about Ireland and Iceland. Is there being in Glasgow for the last 12 months, is there going to be sort of a Glasgow period to your compositional work as well?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose
Or a Scottish section?
I wonder. I mean, I'm working on a lot of music at the moment, so I wonder will it seep through naturally. Like one of the projects I'm doing now is kind of to do with this very interesting story about a Viking woman who moved from Norway to Scotland to Iceland. So I'm kind of
Wow.
looking a little bit at that journey, and I've always been interested in kind of Scandinavian music anyway, and Scottish music and Icelandic music. So I'm making those connections and looking at things like Hardanger fiddle and all of that. And I suppose I'm very interested in seeing the connection between music from Norway and like Shetland, and so there's I'm very interested in the islands. So this is a piece actually that will be performed later in the year on the Scottish islands. So it's kind of to do with
Wow.
so that will be that that is bringing some Scottish element in there for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
Wow. Which Scottish islands is it going to tour to? Do you know? Or?
Well, of course, all of that is a little bit up in the air. But it was meant originally for Orkney
Oh,
and
okay.
possibly also Shetland.
Right.
Mm. Mm.
Have you been to Orkney?
I haven't. No, I haven't. I'd love
Wow.
to go.
Yeah. I've been lucky to go a couple of times as part of the wonderful festival that it must be the Maxwell Davis Festival, St Magnus Festival, which happens every summer. And
Mm.
it's, as you know, in these northerly islands, I think we were there in June, and the sky gets a little bit hazy at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and then at about 4 o'clock in the morning, it's bright sunlight again.
Mm-hmm.
Utterly bizarre place, and
Mm.
um,
Mm.
really, really, really amazing to be there. I seem to remember seeing no trees for a week because there's very few. Seems to be very few trees, or I'm not quite sure what that is. I guess it's something to do with the wind and the sea and the salt or
Mm.
whatever.
Mm.
Yeah, wow. So when will that piece happen? When's that
I
meant to
think
happen?
that's going to happen in September. And
Great.
there's lots of interesting things happening this year, actually. Just while we're talking about percussion, it's making me think a little bit of a project happening later in the year, which is a co-composition project with my sister Irene, who's also a
Oh
composer.
wow.
And we're doing a live score to the film Metropolis, and it will be for percussion ensemble and electronics. So,
Nice.
so we're going to start kind of brainstorming that soon. That'll be the end of this year.
Fantastic.
Mm.
Another version of Metropolis.
It's actually the original, but it's a live score to it, so it's the original.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, which is
Wow.
a kind of epic 2.5 hour film. So that'll
Yeah.
be a big undertaking.
With those, it's kind of got people dressed as robots, and I haven't seen it
It's
for the.
very strange and futuristic, and
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to work on it at the moment with everything that has happened in the world. I think actually, in terms of that
Yeah.
kind of sort of dark energy and atmosphere, and yeah, I mean, I'm excited for that later this year.
And so, working with your sister, how will that work as a collaborative composing? Have you done that before? Have you guys
We
done
have
that
done it
before?
before, yeah. So
Wow.
we've done a score to Nosferatu. So the
Okay.
original Murnau film, we've used viola, cello, pipe organ, and electronics, and that was originally done in Union Chapel in London,
Yeah.
actually for Organ Reframed Festival in 2016 originally, and then we've done that a number of times in different places. The last time we did it was in New York, actually. So
Yeah.
it's like we work together very naturally because I suppose we know each other so well. Kind of, we're only a year apart in age as well. So we have very similar interests musically. So it kind of, a shorthand that just worked very well for us, I
Yeah.
think.
And when you're working together, do you sit down and write music together for the same time frame, or do you sort of take it in turns to take different parts of the score, or how does it work?
A bit of both, yeah. So we might we'll often sit down and kind of map out the film together, and then we might work on certain sections together, and then we might kind of go off and be like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do these few minutes here. You go do
Yeah.
these, and then stitch it together, and it tends to work because our aesthetic is so kind of similar that it just seems to work. So it's
Yeah.
just naturally. I think it's just we're a bit lucky in that way that. Um, there's not a disconnect in terms of styles that would jar or anything like that. But we bring different things to it, of course. But it's always lovely to kind of work against someone like that because composing can be very solitary as well. So it's
Yeah.
always nice to work with others. Mm.
Absolutely. And then you said you talked a bit about doing live electronics. So is
Mm.
that using samples or treating acoustic instruments or?
Well, I think there probably will be live processing of instruments, and possibly I'm thinking about trying to incorporate some kind of like analog synth into this, but I have to really figure that out and
Yeah,
try and see what can be achieved and what exactly can we get. Because of course I love working with things like the Moog, but I won't be able to get a massive Moog System 55 or anything like that. But we'll see. Yeah, so something like that I think visually could be amazing as well. Like just a lot of wires. That's what I want to see.
yeah.
I
So
want
you,
to see a lot of wiring.
gives you a kind of corner of the stage to fill up with
Yeah.
your gear and your setup. There's an amazing version of. Well, there's lots of versions of scores to Joan of Arc, which is another black and white film from the 20s. And I've been involved in performing on a version by Will Gregory and A. Dudley, which is
Oh.
kind of synthy and guitar-y and occasionally percussion-y. And it's got a bit of everything. It's got a really big ensemble, and there's always this great moment where Adrian is with his guitars and paintbrushes and distortion, and you can just see this focus and everything kind of getting very rock and roll in a very out there sort of a way, which is amazing. So yeah,
I've seen them. Well, I've seen the Moog Ensemble.
oh yeah,
The
yeah,
series.
that Will's
Yeah,
group, yeah,
yeah.
that's a very cool group of
Very
um,
cool.
nine. Is it a nonette? It's nine Moogs or nine
Hmm.
Moogs. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. That's a wicked thing. Well,
Hmm.
have you seen anything? Have you? I mean, you obviously haven't seen any gigs recently, but have you? Is there anything that's caught your ear or your eye musically over the last 12 months? Obviously,
Well, actually, someone that I'm listening to a lot lately is Katarina Barbieri. She's this amazing young Italian electronic musician who works a lot with analog gear and sort of improvises live. But it's very beautiful. It's often very harmonic and very minimal. And I love how she talks about the process of making music as well, and it's very kind of intuitive and instinctive. And she's saying even though I'm using these technical instruments, the way I think about it isn't in a technical way. I think about the soul of the instrument and creating something really beautiful. And yeah, she's been really inspiring for me in the last
wow,
year or so.
great, something else for me to go and check out, catch up on.
I think you'd like
Cool.
it.
Yeah, nice. Well, listen, we've been talking for ages. I could do this for a very long time, and probably not run out of things to ask you about music. But you've probably got something that you need to go and write. So I think we should sort of. I think we should probably wrap it up. And I hope that we can get back in a room together sometime soon and maybe talk about another project and yeah, even just have a drink together. That'd be nice.
It would be great.
Or go to a gig together. Yeah, or
Yeah.
do a gig together again.
I'll write you a very crazy, rhythmic, raucous piece.
As long as someone else is going to bring the instruments, that's going to work really well for me.
Yeah.
Fantastic, great. Listen, it's so good to catch up. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me and to tell us a bit about Ekstasis. And yeah, I hope to
Thank
catch up
you.
soon.
Great to see you. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Linda. Cheers. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.